Perfect. I'm going to start. Good morning, everyone. My name is Leah Molatseli. I'm Head of Business Development here at Legal Interact. Welcome to the LexisNexis and Legal Interact webinar supported by Microsoft South Africa. Today's session is titled Staying Ahead of White-Collar Crime. Now, we're going to look into steps that law firms can take as accountable institutions when it comes to safeguarding and mitigating against potential exposure to money laundering and ensuring compliance in terms of FICA. Now, the FICA Act as amended in 2019 is largely focused on a risk-based approach, which means there's a huge burden on accountable institutions not only to screen, but also verify the type of transactions and people that they engage with in business. Now, playing a huge role in terms of FICA compliance should not be seen as a burden. It should be seen as a way that you can actually be an active participant and partner to our national government. It's actually also a less punitive approach in terms of obligations. So in order to dissect this, today I'm joined by renowned Stephen Powell. He is head of the forensics department at ENSafrica. We'll talk later and he'll introduce himself properly. And then I'm also joined by Rudi Kruger, GM of risk management and international online services at LexisNexis. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good morning. Hi, Leah. Morning, everyone.
Now, before we start, just some administrative aspects to the audience. Thank you again for joining us today. Please use the chat box, for general responses and so forth. And should you wish to ask a question, you can use the Q&A option. So, gentlemen, I'm excited to have you here. Stephen, I think we should start with you. Can you tell us more about your background?
Certainly, Leah. I started as a prosecutor many years ago. I'm going to give away my age here, but in the early 90s. And what happened is I very soon got roped into dealing with white-collar crime fraud cases. And I found that incredibly challenging and fascinating, following money trail, identifying evidence to link perpetrators to corrupt transactions. That was all quite challenging work. And I got really drawn into that. And the more that I did in that area, the more fraud and corruption cases my bosses used to send my way. And I became a fraud specialist. And then after prosecuting for about 8 years, I moved into the private sector. And I was a partner at Deloitte for just under 6 years. And for the last 18 years, I've been at ENSafrica, the law firm, heading forensics and dealing with white-collar crime, fraud and corruption, both proactive, defensive, as well as reactive, investigating the cases. Thanks, Leah.
Interesting journey. Thank you so much, Stephen. Before we get deeper with you in terms of conversating, I'd just like Rudi to introduce himself so that the audience knows who he is.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Rudi Kruger. I joined LexisNexis 15 years ago. And I service customers around enhanced due diligence processes, fraud prevention, and also played a major role in developing some of these solutions, especially around fraud development, know your customers, risk assessment, to help customers with their compliance obligations. Prior to LexisNexis, I worked for Standard Bank, where I filled many roles, and the last couple of roles there was in the anti-money laundering division, compliance. And we looked at screening and monitoring of terrorist financing and money laundering and politically exposed individuals to protect the banks and the financial system within the banks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just so everyone is on the same page, my name is Leah Molatseli. By profession, I'm a lawyer, but I'm a hardcore legal tech and innovation junkie. This is why I'm head of business development here at Legal Interact, which is a legal tech company that builds legal tech solutions for the legal community. So Stephen, I think we can just start with you. So you indicated that you started in prosecution and so forth, and somehow your journey led you to this. So now we know how you ended up specializing, but what has kept you in this space?
It's actually really fascinating work. You know, what happens, Leah, is, you know, one week I'll be working in mining, next week I'll be working in the financial services sector. And, you know, we deal with so many different industry sectors and so many different types of fraud and corruption. And you're continuously learning. So I find that the forensic work, just investigating white collar crime, is a fascinating journey to be part of, but it's also incredibly rewarding. You know, we do all the homework behind the scenes. So for example, we deal with suspects who won't even know that we are investigating them, and we will do the background checks, we'll profile the suspects. And then one of the things that we've particularly adept at is doing email reviews and looking at the communications between our suspect, the potential perpetrator, and various other role players in the fraud. If it's a procurement fraud, we'll be looking at what they're doing, what they're saying to the suppliers. And then once we've gathered all of the evidence, we then go into confrontation mode. And I must tell you, I've done this for so many years, but your adrenaline still gets pumping when you go into that situation where you're going to talk to a fraudster. They've got no idea that you've been doing all this homework about them. And then we start engaging. And what I find fascinating is just human nature, how people lie and try and deceive. And one of the areas where I've also specialized was in deception detection techniques, trying to interpret and understand the nonverbal clues to when people are lying, when they've been honest and open, and trying to build a rapport with the perpetrator to get them to cooperate, and then really to help just unravel what has happened. And often, you know, if we deal with the fraud that's been happening over the last 2-3 years, we start talking about hundreds of transactions, and the values obviously go up exponentially. And it becomes quite an exciting and complex challenge to unravel. But that's the thrill of the work that we do. It's fascinating work, and getting people to cooperate, to work with us. You know, what happens in the criminal justice system in South Africa, if someone denies that they are complicit in fraud and we prove the fraud against them, and we can do that quite effectively through following the money. If the money leads to a personal bank account and it's corporate funds, there's a problem for any fraudster to try and explain that away. And so what we try and do is get them into a mode where they cooperate, where they understand that they are facing, if the values are above R500,000, it's a mandatory 15-year jail sentence. So we try and get the suspect to go into cooperation mode where they work with us, they tell us what is happening, and then they also help mitigate the potential punishment, and they become eligible to do a plea and sentence negotiation with the state and negotiate a much softer landing than the 15-year long-term imprisonment. But it's fascinating and rewarding, and it's unpredictable. You never know what's going to happen. But when we do our homework properly, 9 times out of 10, it goes according to plan. And that's what I really enjoy.
Lovely. You know, I can even hear the passion in your voice as you explain this. So, Stephen, you know, we once spoke and then you said, you know, there's been an increase in exposure, but not necessarily the crime. Could you please elaborate a bit on this?
Yeah, certainly. What has happened in South Africa is we've actually had a really tough last decade, and I like to call these the Zuma years. And we've gone backwards in terms of enforcement. We've decapacitated many of the institutions which were designed to fight fraud and corruption, and things like the demise of the Scorpions, which I thought was a really effective and robust way of tackling white collar crime, where you had prosecutor driven investigations. We disbanded that early in the Zuma regime. And then we've had these commissions of inquiry, which has graphically exposed the corruption that has taken place right under our noses. And obviously, you know, we hear the saying, the fish rots from the head. And unfortunately, we had a really bad example set by our former president. And we are in a process of rebuilding. And I think later on, as we progress in this panel discussion, we'll talk a lot about the positive things that are happening. But what that does mean is, as a country, we're in a bad space. we've been evaluated by the Financial Action Task Force. We've been a member of the FATF since 2003. And last year, they did a mutual evaluation report on South Africa, and they've indicated that when it comes to financial crime, we have some really robust laws. We've got good infrastructure when we look at the legislation, but we really don't have enough enforcement. And I think that's quite a strong thread coming out of the various commissions as well, the recommendations from the State Capture Commission that a number of people should be subjected to further investigation and prosecution. And what is really nice about the work of the Zondo Commission in particular is that they followed the money trails and they've subpoenaed a lot of the financial transaction records, and they can show where people were complicit in corrupt activity. So we've got this massive exposure. The exposure of fraud and corruption is greater than it's ever been in our country, but at the same time, it's also exposed the shortcomings. And I think there's a big challenge for the NPA to convert the evidence that has been led at these commissions, the Nugent Commission, the Zondo Commission, etc., into successful prosecution. But at the same time, when we talk about the heightened exposure of white-collar crime and corruption in South Africa, we have to applaud our independent media, because throughout the Zuma years, when all this corruption was flourishing, the Mail and Guardian, Amagubani, at Daily Maverick, all of these media bodies, Business Day, etc., all of these bodies were very, very active in exposing some of the corrupt activities by the rogues. So we've got this heightened exposure. And I wouldn't really say that the volume of crime has not increased, just the exposure has. I think that the volumes have increased. And one of the risks is that the cyber fraud has taken off. And I read an interesting quote the other day, and we're dealing with the COVID pandemic. But 2021 was the worst year in history globally for cyber fraud. It was a record year where things have just reached unprecedented levels. So the onus on all businesses and accountable institutions like law firms, estate agents, financial institutions, brokers, advisors, etc., the onus is on these bodies to know their customers, do the KYC. And there's one term that Rudi used a few minutes ago, and I'll allow him to elaborate on this in a moment. But more than ever before, companies have to be doing proper homework. They've got to be doing the maximum they can to protect themselves against a pervasive fraud and corruption, money laundering, terrorist financing threat. And so having the right processes in place, and the catchword that I think I wanted to refer to that Rudi mentioned, due diligence is so important. You've got to know your customer, but more important than knowing your customer, you've actually got to know your suppliers, and you've got to do due diligence on your supply chain. And I think on that note, I can see that Rudi is rearing to add a contribution just to some of those aspects I've touched on, Leah.
Yes, Stephen, so it's quite interesting. So I read an article about PwC. They did an audit or a survey in 2020, and the findings were that external fraud was 36%, internal fraud 41%. It's only employees looking at fraud. Then collusion between employees and external parties is 21%. So that adds up to 62% of all fraud taking place in your company. This normally comes from internal somewhere in your mind. So you need to look at supplier, but you also need to look at your employees, and fraud prevention starts normally at your employee level before you move on to it.
Absolutely, Rudi. And Leah, if I can just add, when I speak about the Financial Action Task Force mutual evaluation report that they issued, they identified, and their findings don't align with how South African authorities rate themselves, but they've indicated that banks, attorneys, estate agents are among the most vulnerable sectors that are exposed to money laundering and terrorist financing. And that is followed by asset managers, casinos, trust service providers, and a lot of business sectors and professions, outside of financial services also pose a money laundering risk. And, this is problematic because we have to address it. And one of the areas that they highlighted is that South Africa was not doing enough to identify ultimate beneficial owners. There's a term which we use in anti-corruption circles called UBOs. And what is quite just comforting on my side that I can share with the audience today is that, during the course of last year, South Africa has reacted to this poor report that we got from the FATF, and we have introduced a bill just to really clamp down. We're going to amend our Companies Act to enhance disclosure of the ultimate beneficial owner. That is quite important. And then if we look at what is coming out of the recommendations from the Zondo Commission, they've made comprehensive recommendations for a virtual overhaul of our system. And there are quite a number of areas where, the Zondo Commission has recommended that we start copying what some of the global countries have done when it comes to preventing money laundering, when it comes to preventing fraud and corruption. There's a lot more that we can be doing. And I think the onus is for every business, every law firm, every accountable institution out there to up their game. And where I think it starts is with something which is referred to by the FATF, and it's also part of the Companies Act guidelines when it comes to compliance programs, and that is a risk assessment. Companies need to understand the threats, the risks that they face. They need to understand their own vulnerabilities, and then they've got to make sure that they use the tools, the software that is out there, and every law firm out there should have their own screening tools, that they can screen against watch lists for corrupt activities, AML sanctions. All of those lists are globally available. And so we should be doing this, the KYC, not just on customers, as I said earlier, but also on our entire supply chain. And there are quite a few. So I think let me hand back to Rudi, Leah, and then I'll happily walk us through just some of those recommendations that I think are quite far-reaching that have come out of the State Capture Commission. Over to you, Rudi.
Before we hit there, I just want us to keep on track because you two, you're going that way.
Yeah.
Stephen, you mentioned a bit around where we are from a global perspective. Are you in a position just to tell us, reputational risk, managing it, and integrity is obviously a global focus. From a South African perspective, where do we stand?
Certainly, Leah, and that's a very good question. If we were to be graded, if this was a university exam, we'd be failing, because as a country, the first thing that I look at is the Transparency International Index. And what is our score on that index? 44 out of 100. 44, we're not even at 50%, and that is not great. We've maintained the position. We're currently at 70 out of 180 countries on that TI index. And what this means is we are regarded as a high-risk jurisdiction. So when people are looking at where to invest, we're not attracting the investors because of the corruption levels. And I think last year's looting incident certainly set us back even further. But that's the first barometer that I look at. So we also regarded as an anti-money laundering risk center. We're not a tax haven, thank heavens, but we are regarded as an area, where drug dealers, etc., resort to placing funds. And so I think that's quite important. And we get rated there. There's a Basel anti-money laundering index. And last year, there was insufficient information for them to actually comment on our position, which was not great. And then I think the other thing that I highlighted is that the Financial Action Task Force has highlighted, that we are not doing particularly well. And we were previously evaluated by the Financial Action Task Force in 2009, and we've slid backwards. We've actually deteriorated as a country when it comes to anti-money laundering and terrorist finding. So if I just look at our scorecard by the FATF, they say that we are largely, there's 40 recommendations that they encourage all member countries to adopt and enact. And the risk is if we're non-compliant with the FATF recommendations, we can be excluded from the global financial markets. And that would be, traumatic for us as a country. We are largely compliant with 17 FATF recommendations. We are only fully compliant with 3 of their recommendations. That's really not great. And we are partially compliant with 15, and we're non-compliant with 5 of the recommendations. So when we talk about the enactment of the Companies Bill, Amendment Bill, to force the disclosure of ultimate beneficial ownership, that is really important, because opaque ownership structures are where money laundering and corruption has been allowed to flourish. So as a country, we are tackling that. But if I just run through some of the other areas where as a country, we're not doing terribly well, we are rated on a tier 2 watch list by the US Department of State when it comes to modern slavery and human trafficking. So it's not great for us to be regarded as a human trafficking destination. We also are regarded as a high risk of drug and wildlife trafficking. And environmental crime is also high risk in South Africa. And then when we add the fraud to that, the picture is starting to sound a little bleak, Leah, but it's not all bad news. There's a lot that we can do as businesses and organizations out there to address this. But when we talk about fraud, we are regarded as a high-risk jurisdiction for fraud, and we have massive volumes of identity theft. And identity theft is really disruptive. It's affecting individuals, but we also have corporate identity theft and business email compromise. So when it comes to cybercrime, the quote that I wanted to mention earlier is I read somewhere that we are going through a digital pandemic of epic proportion. And I think that just, as if COVID was not enough. And then when it comes to tax crime and financial security, that falls down into the medium risk, which is slightly better. And I think the big risk was the FATF, their report on where we are. So as a country, we're not doing terribly well. And that means that it's almost incumbent on businesses to do the maximum to protect themselves, because while this pandemic is raging, they've got to make sure that they've inoculated themselves against the fraud disease. And that's where, following all the controls, doing due diligence, etc., come in. Thanks, Leah.
Perfect. Speaking about fraud and so forth, a lot of fraud and corruption has been highlighted. I mean, you also mentioned the Zondo Commission and so forth. In terms of these commissions and, the work that they're doing, are we catching the right things? Are we systematically looking at the right things, catching the right things? Where are we?
Leah, if I may just answer that one. For me, the commissions have been invaluable. It's almost like a cathartic process where you actually talk about what has gone wrong, and we've exposed this to the world. And there's a lot of criticism about this, because now we regard it as this high corruption risk jurisdiction, because we've actually exposed ourselves to the rest of the world. But we needed to deal with what happened during the Zuma years. And what the commission has done is, one, they've heard all the evidence and it's been vocalized, and it follows the really good work done by our former public protector who issued the first state capture report. That had to go through the next level. And I think the commission's played an invaluable part in bringing all of this out into the public arena. I actually testified on 2 occasions. I gave evidence at the Zondo Commission, and I highlighted some of the bribes that we had come across on one of our large ICT investigations. And I think that process was very necessary. They've also recommended prosecution. And you heard earlier, I mentioned that one of the things that I was particularly impressed about by the work of the commission is they had these really diligent and amazing evidence leaders who did all of the homework, analyzed all of these transactions, and did what I've been doing for the last number of years, following the money trails. And they exposed those money trails in open court. And there were a number of people that were caught in embarrassing situations trying to explain. There was a former minister, I'm not going to name the minister, but I think everyone will be able to work out who it was. There was a minister who received an Aston Martin as a gift funded by a friend. And this was supposed to be personal financial support. I gave evidence against one particular minister, deputy minister, who received a loan of R1 million. And when we asked, is there a loan agreement? No, there's no loan agreement. What's the repayment terms? Have you repaid any money? No. When are you going to repay? When I get back on my feet. And the question was, what did you do with the R1 million that you received? The answer to Judge Zondo was, I bought a Jeep. It's exposed a lot of that mischief. And I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit for the state to look at converting into successful prosecution. But the Zondo Commission doesn't stop with the recommendations for prosecution. I think what the judge has tried to do is the commission has sought to create a holistic frame of recommendations to really improve our infrastructure and our ability to fight corruption. And I spoke earlier about how disappointed I was at the demise of the Scorpions, but the recommendation to create this, they call it the PPACA, it's a public procurement anti-corruption agency, a dedicated agency to fight corruption. I think that is the way of the rest of the world. If we look at what they do in the US, the DOJ, Department of Justice, and the SEC are both bodies that pursue violations of FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of the United States. And they have vast powers to negotiate settlements with companies that have paid bribes. And they have recovered a lot of money for the American fiscus out of penalizing companies that pay bribes, but they make an example of those companies. And we see justice in action. And I think we're emulating those types of bodies. And we have the same with the Serious Fraud Office in the United Kingdom that robustly pursues companies associated with the United Kingdom that pay bribes across our borders. And the agency, if they follow the example set by the UK and the US, they'll be able to really make examples of companies that bribe in South Africa and other parts of Africa. And the world is really getting tough on corruption. So that's the first big issue that I think I wanted to highlight, is that I think the creation of this dedicated agency is a really positive step. We've had a task force previously, and my criticism of any task force is that it's made up of part-time members of different government agencies. And the problem is that those members still have their day job waiting for them back at their own office. And they're just there in a temporary capacity, whereas we need a dedicated agency or body that tackles corruption. So I think we've managed to if we implement that, that will be really positive. And then the next one is we've got to make sure that we tap into whistleblowers. And what the US Department of Justice and the SEC have done is they've incentivized whistleblowers. So if your company is paying a bribe, and there are a whole lot of employees, finance managers, people in different accounting roles that are aware of that bribe, any of the individuals in the company can become a whistleblower. And if the evidence that they provide leads to a successful prosecution, the DOJ makes public announcements of rewards, and they reward people by massive amounts. The record award was in 2014, where an individual got $30 million US. And you can just imagine that type of incentive really gets people to blow the whistle on crime. And one of the recommendations from the Zondo Commission is, one, we've got to protect our witnesses better, because in South Africa, we don't just have no incentive for whistleblowers. We have the fact that whistleblowers get murdered. When we had the World Cup, we had whistleblowers blowing the lid on corruption on the construction of some of those stadiums. They were just taken out. So we need to protect and ensure the physical safety and security of our whistleblowers, but we're also looking at incentivizing. And then there's a concept which I think won't be familiar to many of the audience, but I think it is worth explaining. They're also talking about introducing DPAs. And the DPA is quite an important innovation because it's a deferred prosecution agreement. And in order to be eligible for a deferred prosecution agreement, the company has to self-report when they find corruption within their ranks. And they also need to put measures in place to prevent the corruption. So one of the further measures recommended by the State Capture Commission is amendments to PRECA and making provision for a defense to a charge of failing to prevent corruption by having adequate procedures in place. And I think this ties into the area that Rudi can talk about again, because adequate procedures means that you've got to demonstrate that you are doing the due diligence, you are doing the training, and you're rolling out all of the different mechanisms to prevent corruption. And I'll come back to adequate procedures because I think we must use today's workshop to educate the audience on what would constitute adequate procedures in a South African environment. So on that note, Leah, let me hand back to you. Sorry, I'm conscious that I'm giving a long lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your insights, Stephen. I think there's a broader understanding of the topic, but I think now it's also time for us to delve deeper, particularly in terms of our audience, being lawyers and for law firms. So Rudi, this is where you come in. Over the past couple of months, the Financial Intelligence Center has been auditing law firms directly, and more than 90% of these audits have resulted in non-compliance. What are the systems or methods that lawyers or law firms can actually employ in order for them to ensure that they're actually compliant?
Yes, thanks, Leah. So maybe to start with saying, well, why were there so many findings? It's between 80 and 90% of law firms were found not to be compliant. So the number one was they're not registered with FIT. So they didn't register themselves as an accountable institution, which is an obvious finding. So you need to make sure you're registered and you make sure you keep your information updated with the FIC. The second one was that they didn't have efficient policies and procedures in place. So they trying to take a standard policy procedure and implement it in their law firm. It's not unique to their business and the way they operate. And then there's also the last finding was on they don't have an adequate KYC processing. So I think a lot of law firms think if you get a copy of the ID and the address and the affidavit saying you're not politically exposed, that is solving the problem, but it's not solving the problem. So the FIC wants you to implement a risk management compliance program, which means it's a risk-based approach. So it depends on the risk on your particular business and firm. You need to implement then policies, procedures to protect your organization against money laundering, terrorist financing. You also need to have enhanced customer due diligence process in place. So due diligence doesn't mean an ID check. That means you need to electronically verify the information. You need to make sure there's sanctions in a politically exposed check that was done on individuals. You've got access to adverse media, saying if there's reports of someone that might be involved in corruption, you need to do those type of checks. And then they also want you to have a very unique risk assessment on each customer. And each of your customers within your firm must be risk rated, saying it's a low risk or a high risk organization or customer individual I'm dealing with. So, and those questions must be standard. So you can't define the questions for every term you risk assess the customer. If you don't want to have a low risk customer and a high risk customer, you change the question. So it must be a standard set of questions that keeps being revised. So you have to revise those questions as your business or services change and your customers changes to make sure you comply with all those processes.
Thank you so much for sharing. And while talking about systems and processes, I wanted just to get both your opinions from a technology perspective. So for example, here at Legal Interact, we have a practice management solution. It's called Practice Manager Pro. Now within that, they've built in a FICA compliance aspect where it gatekeeps certain actions. So you can't say charge or bill your client if you are not compliant with certain things. And they've also managed to integrate the targeted financial sanctions list within that to actually check, the clients that you're onboarding onto your system. Now, how important is it for lawyers, law firms to actually employ automated processes, systems, and technologies into their practices in order to ensure compliance?
If I can start there, maybe. So I think of all the audits I've seen so far, there's human error taking place. Humans, it's not machines. They can't work 24 hours a day, and they do interpret data. So when you ask a machine to interpret data and use technology to run your processes and your unique questionnaires and managing your risks, that always give you the same answer, because you'll ask questions and the machine will also always give you the right answers. So I do think technology is the only way of going into the future. You need to move away from paper information. And it's also when FIC walks in, they want to do an audit on you, they're going to ask you for proof and evidence you've done those due diligence on it. And how do you prove it from audit trail? So, and customer due diligence is not only a once-off when you open a matter saying stamped, move on. It's me ongoing. So as long as your business transaction continues with this customer, you need to go ongoing monitoring on those customers. And to have a clear audit trail and all those risk assessments right through the lifespan of the customer, you need to prove it. And it's easier if you have not technology, because you can open the technology up to the FIC and they can actually look at the audit trail of what took place in it tomorrow.
And you, Stephen, any thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. What happens is it starts with the policies, so for me, you've actually got to make sure that you've mapped out the procedures and you've guided your employees on what is allowed and what's not allowed. And then the process when it comes to screening new customers. And remember, there's an obligation not just to be the gatekeeper and screen the new customers. You've also got to find ways to screen your existing client database. And as Rudi mentioned, the other ingredient is you have to demonstrate that you are monitoring compliance. And you check in to see that your people are adhering to your controls and your policies. And you've got to make sure that the system is working. And then when we look at I think one of the recommendations that we should be making today is that organizations out there won't know exactly what they need to do. So it's important to also look at harnessing the tools and technology that Rudi referred to, because there are systems out there to make life easier for all organizations, including the law firms. And you've got to be able to monitor adverse media. Reputational risk is a big problem in South Africa at the moment. We've had accounting failure after accounting failure. We've had the Gupta issues with KPMG. We've had issues with many other corporates that have experienced accounting failures. And what that means in South Africa is that auditors as a profession are extremely jittery and nervous, and they don't want to be associated with bad customers. So they are looking to be comfortable that their customers have the right processes and procedures in place. And then more importantly, I think it is important to satisfy your auditors that you are doing enough. You've got the FIC, and the FIC, the fact that they're doing audits and they're doing more to test compliance is a warning. It's a red flag to organizations to ensure that they become compliant, but it also fits into the broader picture, because as a country, the FIC has got a role to play to make sure that we're doing more to prevent money laundering and terrorist financing, etc. And so, when we look at those requirements, if you just break it down, it's actually quite simple. You start with the policies, you do the risk assessment to understand your vulnerabilities and exposures, and you draw on best practice as well, because there's a lot of organizations out there that are willing to help organizations that are grappling with how do I become compliant. And I think the big challenge for many organizations is, when they're small and they can't afford to have a dedicated compliance officer, you end up adding this responsibility to people that already have their day jobs and they don't understand the requirements of the new role. So, my advice is get support, tap into what is required, make sure that you harness the tools and technology and get the most cost-effective solution available for your organization. And then the other aspect, which Rudi touched on right at the start, you've got to make sure that you train your people, and you've got to have evidence of the training as well. So do the training, have the registers, And when it comes to training, you've got to do the training on anti-money laundering, anti-terrorist financing, but also anti-corruption and anti-fraud, because what is happening in the legal services sector is that it's very easy for syndicates to clone invoices from professional service providers like law firms, accounting firms. They intercept the invoice coming from a law firm, and we call it the man in the middle attack. So I send my invoice to you, Leah. You think that you're getting the invoice directly from me, but the syndicate has interposed themselves. And what they then do with that invoice is they're going to clone that invoice. They're going to copy everything. You know that you owe me, say, 100,000 for a job that we've just done for you. So you're expecting my invoice to reflect 100,000. You've got my bank account on your system somewhere because you've paid us previously. But now you're going to get a request and it's going to say that ENS have changed their bank account. Please pay to the following bank account. So you've got to be on your toes and vigilant that people in your accounts payable department aren't simply going to take the new bank account and just pay to it. You've got to make sure that you've got processes to verify when it is a fraudulent cloned invoice. So just on that particular point, what we see is when the syndicates clone an invoice and pretend that it's coming from ENSafrica, the email address of the sender will be ENAfrica instead of ENSafrica, or there'll be some variation, or they'll make it look exactly the same. But if you just hover your mouse over the email address, it'll show you that it's actually John Smith at Yahoo, not Stephen Powell from ENS that is sending you the invoice. The other important giveaway is that the contact details on that invoice are going to change. It's not going to have the law firm's numbers, contact numbers. It's just going to be a cell number. And often they even put a Gmail address on the invoice as a contact email. Nobody should ever be paying any invoice with a Gmail address on it. Sorry, I might be hurting some small businesses that only have Gmail addresses. But those are some of the telltale symptoms. So you've got to make sure that you're training your finance department on that. And then when it comes to onboarding customers, the screening, the checks against sanctions, watch lists, anti-corruption, compliance databases, all of that is also important. You shouldn't be able to open a new client unless you can show that you are compliant and you've done the necessary screening. So I think if you run through some of those requirements, they actually also align with what you need to be doing to prevent corruption, because the CIPC also issued guidelines for all businesses that are subject to Companies Act, and it's a lot of businesses that are subject to Companies Act, because if you are a listed company, you have to apply the Companies Act. But if you score more than 500 points in any of the last 5 years, you also have to comply. How do you score 500 points? If you've got more than 500 employees, you get 1 point per employee. You also get 1 point per million in turnover. So if you've got a big business, you are going to be liable. And a lot of medium and middle tier businesses that think they're not subject to Companies Act are in fact subject to that act. But that requires you to put in these programs as well. And if I can link that back, Leah, it also ties in again to the recommendation from the Zondo Commission that we change the criminal law to create these adequate procedures. And the adequate procedures are important to fight corruption, but it's also there to fight money laundering and all of these other evils. So you can see, if we do all of the things that Zondo has recommended, we'll improve enforcement, we'll improve the holistic infrastructure to fight corruption. Thanks, Leah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Really appreciate both of your insights. And I think now we're going to move through to the live questions. But before we start, just a kind reminder to our audience, if you can provide us with some feedback. I've just shared the link with you. Now let's get into the questions. Stephen, I think this is for you, because you just mentioned commissions. So the question around here on the recommendations that are typically made by commissions, are they effective? Like, should we consider commissions as effective in the country?
I think you're talking to a converted fan of the Zondo Commission. I think that they've done a remarkable job, and they've made a holistic set of recommendations to really improve public procurement and the areas where corruption have flourished with state capture. So, they talk about centralized procurement. They talk about a dedicated office, the procurement officer as a dedicated professional. If all of these things are carried through, if we implement properly, then I think we're going to see some dramatic improvements in addressing corruption in South Africa. Definitely. So I'm really positive. I think that it has worked. We've got to be careful that we don't go into just appointing commissions for every problem we have. We need to see more action than just the commissions, but I think it is useful. Thanks, Leah.
And there's also a question. Peter here says that, there are various legislations, both international and local, legal instruments, software, you name it, that is available for both public and the private in order to actually mitigate some of these risks that we've unpacked today. So how would one ensure action and a culture in the public and private sector that will address poor ratings from the FATF and the TI?
So Rudi's already given some of the answers, and he's mentioned what law firms specifically need to be doing, but I think it's broader. And I mentioned the Companies Act because the CIPC have issued guidelines. Those guidelines were issued in November of 2018. It's downloadable. If you just Google CIPC guidelines, it's short, it's about 4 pages, and they basically set out the adequate procedures. What should you have? So remember, I spoke about the policies and controls, the training, the due diligence, the monitoring. Those are all set out very, very clearly, and companies need to be adopting those. Accountable institutions, it's a non-negotiable. They should be doing all of the AML screening, satisfying the FIC, etc. So let's hear Rudi's thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I agree. So once again, I think technology can help you there, because once you get those policy procedures in place, and we as private sector, but also public sector, when they put technologies and processes in place and they follow those processes to the mandates all the time, so they don't get people to do it, they get machines to do it, it's easier to do it. We've got a tool called Lexis Procure Check, which help you with procurement management and identify a risk between your employees and your vendors. But also a KYC, where we look at the in-depth risk assessment of particular customers that you are dealing with. And the questions are standard, so you can't avoid the question. If you do it on paper, once again, you can avoid questions and you can change the answer the way that you perceive it. When someone asks a question and it's a yes/no type question, you can only get one type of answer out of it. I think that's what we need to do, is that everyone needs to play a part in it. And the only way of playing a part is to make sure your process and procedures stand up, you fight corruption, and it starts with all of us. Every single accounts institution was identified because it's a gateway to launder money. And if your accounts institution need to play your part to make sure we do not launder money.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Well, Stephen, this is particularly for you. There's a question around, you have worked previously, as a prosecutor and so forth. Do you have confidence in the current makeup of the APA, whether they have the necessary capacity, resources, and ability to actually prosecute these types of cases?
Leah, that's a tough question, and it really is putting me on the spot. And I think there's a challenge to the. Thank you. No, I have tremendous confidence that there are a large number of really dedicated, committed, excellent prosecutors within the ranks of the NPA. It is a rebuilding phase that the NPA is in at the moment. And one of the most positive initiatives that I think is happening in the country at the moment is that big business is trying to support the NPA with its rebuilding and with the conversion of the evidence from the various commissions into successful prosecutions. And they have created a fund where companies can put in funds without controlling any specific aspect of any prosecution and not influencing the independence of the NPA to prosecute without fear or favor. There is this financial support that is currently being given to the NPA, which I think is going to add value. The NPA is also looking at introducing private counsel to bolster their ranks, to deal with some of these complex cases. And I think all of that is going to bear fruit. And one of the other initiatives is that I'm aware of is that the NPA has also co-opted many of the really competent and capable evidence leaders that were leading the evidence. I think we saw some of these people in action. They were absolutely brilliant stalwarts, putting some very difficult questions to a few squeamish politicians on numerous occasions. And they are being co-opted by the NPA. They've been given contracts to assist the state in converting the evidence. I think we've got to be realistic as well. We know the NPA was broken for quite a number of years, and it's not something that can be fixed overnight. So I think we have to also, as the public, be patient and understand that, people ask the question. It's so clear cut that, you've got Anuj Singh and various others that are really heavily implicated in wrongdoing by the commission. Why don't we just put them behind bars? There's a legal process, and we've got a strong judiciary in South Africa, but the evidence burden is really strong. The state has to prove beyond reasonable doubt. The state has to make sure that it's got all of the evidence at its disposal, ready to prosecute. And the cases are not ready. It's not a simple situation where you take the evidence that was at the Zondo Commission and introduce it in a criminal court. You've got to lead all of those evidence. You've got to also make sure that you follow the money trail 100%. And you can't do it prematurely, because we've seen when the NPA jump in and they try and do things too quickly, they sometimes mess it up. So as members of the public, we've got to give them the time, and we've got to give them the space to get it right. And if the state does pursue these initiatives that I spoke about, adopting strong players in the private sector, some of the top counsel out there are more than willing to act for the state. If they harness all of that and they harness the support of the private sector, the financial support, then I think we'll have a winning solution. And we must tackle, if I can make one recommendation to the NPA, Shamila, I hope you're listening, please tackle some of the low-hanging fruit so that people can see that the system does work and that people who commit fraud and corruption go to jail. I think that's what the public is praying to see and expecting. So let's hope that that happens in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have two questions here. One is relating to training. Is there any training for bankers around, signs of laundering and so forth? Is there available training? Do we have such?
Yep, the banks, I must tell you, in South Africa, I act for many of the large banks, and they have very, very strong anti-money laundering expertise within their organization. So they do offer internal training within their own organizations, but there are specialists in the forensic firms like my own, so we do lots of the anti-fraud AML training. So if anyone is desperate for training and they're not sure where to look, just look at the professional services firms. There's definitely help available out there. And the same applies to the risk assessments. If you're not sure what your program should entail and you're not sure how effective your current compliance programs are, you can have those benchmarked, evaluated, and you can actually draw on industry best practice to improve your systems. Leah, I saw there was a question asking if the FATF mutual evaluation report is available. Can we provide a link? So I've just put it into the chat room. That report is a PDF and it's readily available. So I've put the link in and people can just click on that link to download it. Thanks, Leah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And then, okay, so you've answered that. Okay, one last one before we close. There's a question around, are we going to see anyone being implicated in the Zondo Commission being prosecuted?
Yeah, I think, Leah, we have addressed that, and definitely you've heard all the initiatives to tackle the low-hanging fruit. And I see one of the questions on the screen in front of me is, show us the money. I feel there's not enough said about recoveries of money. And I think that's an important point that I also want to emphasize. One of the bodies that was very active in the pre-Zuma years was the asset forfeiture unit. You know, you remember when Willie Hofmeyer first was appointed as head of the AFU, there was a lot of active matters, and I acted as a curator, seizing assets, freezing bank accounts, going out. And I remember some exciting times going to the homes of drug dealers out in Belleville South and attaching their motor vehicles, freezing bank accounts. And we saw justice in action. And I think the second message that I've given the message to Shamila and the NPA, but my other message is to the asset forfeiture unit. We need to get more active, and we need to demonstrate that criminals will not retain the proceeds of crime. We've got to show that asset forfeiture works. The asset forfeiture legislation was created in 1998 with poker. I actually did one of the first asset forfeiture orders. There was a drug dealer by the name of Melvin Bathgate that I was appointed to go and seize his assets and freeze his bank accounts. He ended up doing some time in jail ultimately for the crime, and we repatriated, we recovered a lot of those funds. And I've done one for Alamashea, one of the Nigerian governors who stole about $55 million US. He bought some properties in South Africa, and I was also appointed to go and seize his assets. And we sold that, the property that he bought in the waterfront, and we repatriated those funds to Nigeria. So I think your question, Darren, is very valid. AFU, we need to show that we are effective when it comes to attaching assets. Thank you. Thanks, Leah.
Thank you so much, Stephen Powell and Rudi Kruger. I had fun facilitating this session. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And thank you for everyone who joined us today. Please don't forget to complete the feedback session. And I hope that today's session was also very valuable as you continue with your day. And thank you once again to Stephen. We really, really appreciate your time. And this session will be available. It's been recorded, so it will be made available in a couple of days for anyone who wants to rewatch this. And also, please don't forget to sign up for upcoming webinars from LexisNexis. Thank you, everyone. Stay well.
Thanks, Leah. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Leah. Thanks, Stephen.
Yeah.